Whether you are standing at the pump or standing at the stove, you are probably very aware of the price spikes in fuel and food that were supposed to be temporary, but have become as persistent as a COVID cough. So, those two categories, food and fuel, are the source of hot data for this month. Welcome to Global Sourcing Insights from CIPS. This edition is a co-production of CIPS Americas and the Michigan State University Broad College of Business. I'm Bob Rossback, and here to explain our key trend data is Jason Miller, Associate Professor in the Broad College of Business at Michigan State University. Welcome, Jason.
Thank you so much for having me on, Bob.
So let's turn to food first. What are the data telling us? You've charted the costs of food inputs. That's grains, fuel, fertilizer, packaging, all the things that it takes to make food.
And so unfortunately, we've experienced substantial food inflation at the consumer level. So as of the February data, we're up 14% from where we were right before the start of the COVID pandemic. The challenge right now is that food prices that consumers are going to be paying are going to be going even higher in the coming months. And we can see that because we've had very substantial increases in the input prices that food manufacturers are paying. And as this chart shows, as input prices go up, those output prices, which the Bureau of Labor Statistics measures separately, those go up. So input prices are up 26% since before COVID as of this February. Output prices are up 18%. The prices consumers are paying are up about 14%. You can expect that we're going to see another couple percentage point increases in consumer prices for food at home over the coming months as manufacturers have to pass on their higher costs to the end customer.
Okay, that's going to be a big impact.
Unfortunately, it is, and this is almost surprising to us because it felt like in the second half of 2021, things started to normalize a little bit. But this really comes down to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, pushing up fertilizer costs even more. Most fertilizers are up more than 100% from their pricing available last year. And now we're starting to see the grain markets get even more heated. And ultimately, even if the U.S. is an exporter of grains, as there's more competition for those grains, well, that's going to drive up the price of what we're consuming domestically.
Okay, so we should look at another benchmark, another input that is very important and has also been greatly affected by the war in the Ukraine. We're talking about fuel, specifically West Texas Intermediate crude oil spot prices. You've charted those, and that's in shorthand WTI. So what is going on with that?
Yeah, so what you can think about what we've got on this next chart is focusing on the relationship between spot prices paid to purchase West Texas Intermediary and then diesel fuel prices, since diesel is going to be that input that is affecting companies' cost structures, since that is the input to, let's say, truck transportation. What we have seen is that, not surprisingly, as oil went from about $90 or $95 a barrel prior to the invasion to spiking up to about $121 on the spot purchases on March 8th, diesel prices have risen. But what we've seen with the last 2 weeks of data from the Energy Information Administration on diesel prices in the U.S. is that those prices have essentially stayed very elevated relative to sort of that trend line that exists between oil price and diesel price. The best explanation I have for that is really it's about uncertainty. If you're a retailer of gasoline and diesel, what you are worried about is the wholesale prices for diesel move very, very, very concomitantly, or they move at the same time as those spot prices do for oil. And as those prices are bouncing up and down, your biggest concern is if I lower my price on the retail side, but then my wholesale price increases. And so we've had so much instability. Oil's been trading on days plus or minus $15 a barrel as the spread. And so what I think we're seeing is that retailers don't want to lower their prices until there's some degree of stability and a sense of what is going to happen in the Ukraine. And the way I think about it is, if you're looking down the road and nobody's lowering their prices, do you have an incentive to lower yours? And the answer is no. And so right now we're caught in a loop where everybody's waiting for more information. And until that information becomes available, they keep their prices elevated.
So we shouldn't really be too harsh on the retailers for sort of riding the crest of the higher prices, because really it may look like predatory practices, but in some ways it's really just defensive, just trying to not get trapped where you are, where they are buying high and selling low.
No, exactly. And the way I think of it is we know from the Census Bureau that in 2017, there were 66,000 firms that owned 115,000 different gas stations in the United States. The top 20 firms have like a 30% market share. That's not an industry structure conducive to collusion to keep prices high. The vast majority, or I should say the majority of gas stations are going to be owned by very small firms that are just trying to keep their heads above water right now, the same as we all are as oil prices are so uncertain.
Okay. So here's sort of a chart that looks in sort of another direction, perhaps, and that's the retail sales volume that you've put together. And has some very recent data, and it's showing a rather sharp downturn in retail sales. So talk us through that.
Yes. So the third chart here is data from the Census Bureau for retail sales, excluding motor vehicles and parts dealers, plus food services. So essentially all of retail trade except those car dealers, plus food services combined together. And then the Chicago Federal Reserve produces this advanced forecast of the data for March. So right now we only have the official data from February, but the Chicago Fed has a great track record of predicting where things are going. So I've appended the March data to this that just came out a couple hours ago. And then the other thing that I've done is adjusted for inflation using a special price deflator that the Bureau of Economic Analysis makes. And the Chicago Fed actually provides their projection of this deflator as well. So I've incorporated that. What we can see here is on a seasonally adjusted basis, there has been a very sharp drop off in retail sales. And what we're seeing is this seems to be indicative of the declining consumer confidence that a lot of different sources have reported on, and also the fact that the inflationary pressures consumers are experiencing is causing them to be able to buy less physical volume of product. And so this situation is one reason we're starting to potentially see the dry van truckload market, which, as many of you know, has been on a record tear since practically June or July of 2020. We felt a lot of softening in the last 3 weeks, and we've been trying to understand what that is. One thing that it feels like it might be looking at these data is maybe retail sales are starting to finally cool down. And this is due to sort of the inflationary pressures. Now, one thing to keep in mind is as the Federal Reserve is starting to think about raising interest rates, on the one hand, they see very strong inflationary forces on, let's say, that food side, so the first chart. But now you add another wrinkle in that they're seeing demand is potentially cooling a little bit in this third chart. So this, I think, is going to complicate the decision about how much rates are going to be raised. Because again, what the Fed is worried about is overcorrecting and putting the economy into a recession.
Yeah, so this is a tough choice. This is a tough balance because if the inflation is just too much money chasing too few goods, that's one thing. But the source of this inflation or the cause of this inflation seems to be kind of coming from other directions. It's disruptions in the supply chain. It's shortages of materials. So it's kind of it's an odd sort of inflation pressure, isn't it?
Yes, it is. And this is where sort of the Bank of England has said that they're publicly taking an approach of viewing a lot of the inflationary forces right now are what we call cost push inflation. So it's companies having to push their higher costs onto the stage further downstream in the supply chain. And the argument that the Bank of England is starting to make is the cure for cost push inflation is letting demand cool. So basically letting it cool itself off, which means we don't need the pronounced interest rate increases. And so I think that the third chart here may be starting to indicate that maybe we don't need multiple, let's say, half percentage point raises, and that we can just sort of let those high food and fuel costs, because those are not costs consumers can allocate away from, we let those play out and they cool down, for example, the demand for cars, and that situation works itself out. The concerns now are essentially how much longer are we going to have material shortages? One index that I produce here at Michigan State suggests that, contra the New York Federal Reserve statement that material and supply chain pressures are easing, we're easing in the fourth quarter of 2021. My index from Census Bureau data suggests they got a little bit worse even than where they were in the third quarter of 2021. So my hope is that they'll peak this quarter and then we will start going down. But that's not an overnight thing. It's going to take another 6-9 months, even if we're peaking now, to really start to get things straightened out.
Excellent. A lot to think about. So how do we react? I'm especially thinking about our procurement planners and our managers of supply chains. Is there a takeaway or two that we can get from this? Because the data seems to be somewhat conflicting. It's not all pointing exactly in the same direction.
So I think the biggest thing is a takeaway is focusing commodity specific right now. And an example of that is steel prices came down 10% in February from where they were in January for domestically made steel. So it feels very much, and we've talked about steel before, steel seems to have turned. So there seems to be good indication steel prices for domestically made steel are going to be coming down. However, take aluminum, where you can't ignore what's going on globally, and especially, the price in the London Metal Exchange, which is still elevated in March from where it was in February, and February was higher in January. So, even if you're an automaker, the steel procurement side may be looking better, but your folks procuring aluminum, they may be having a harder time right now. So I'd say it's commodity specific focus, and really, again, checking with all the different available sources that exist from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. This is why we spend millions of dollars a year producing this data. It isn't just for fun. It's so we can get a sense of what's going on in the pricing environment. I think the other thing is especially understanding, what is the nature of your second, third tier of the supply chain. Are you exposed to the Ukraine or Russia? Wall Street Journal had a very good article talking about some of the challenges manufacturers are having with unwinding from Russia, because they've come to realize that their upstream supply chain is much more intertwined in that country than they expected. And again, keeping abreast of the news cycle right now about what is going on and, the Russia-Ukraine situation. I think most of us suspect that this conflict can't continue that much longer at the current pace, because Russia will essentially exhaust its equipment reserves and manpower reserves given the casualties they've taken. But then that unfortunately raises the specter of, does Putin up the ante through weapons of mass destruction, which unfortunately is not something we can take off the table.
Wow. Well, thank you, Jason. Your insights are always timely and always thought-provoking, even when they're scary. This has been Global Sourcing Insights from CIPS. I'm Bob Rosbeck. Thank you for joining us.